I was sitting at my kitchen table in Billings, Montana, eating cold leftover chili and half watching a video on my phone when I saw my dead son walking through a crowd in Boise, Idaho. My name is Harold Pruitt. I'm 61 years old, retired electrician, widower. I say that up front so you know who's telling the story. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't exaggerate. I spent 35 years pulling wire through walls and conduit for a living, and that kind of work teaches you to deal in facts, not feelings. The facts were these. My son Danny disappeared on a February night in 2021. His truck went off Route 212 during a snowstorm, plunged into a ravine. They found the vehicle. They found his jacket on the seat. They never found him. After 18 months of searching, a judge declared him legally dead. He was 31 years old. I fought the declaration, hired a lawyer with money I didn't really have, filed appeals. Drove out to the ravine myself a dozen times in that first year, walking the tree line with a flashlight like I thought I'd find something the search teams missed. The sheriff's department was patient with me. They said the mountains take people sometimes and don't give them back. They said I needed to accept it. My sister Sandra stood beside me at Danny's memorial service and cried harder than anyone in that room. 6 months later, she had full control of Danny's auto shop and $800,000 from his life insurance policy. I told myself it was legal. Danny had listed her as beneficiary years ago, back when his daughter Lily was just a baby, and he hadn't thought to update his paperwork. I told myself Sandra was doing what made practical sense. She'd always been close to Danny. After our parents died, it was just the two of us, and we'd leaned on each other more than most siblings do. She'd been there when Evelyn got sick. She'd been there when Evelyn passed. She was the one who'd held this family together, or so I believed. I told myself a lot of things in those 3 years. Then I was scrolling through my phone on a Tuesday night, and a video came up. Some random clip posted online, a fall festival in Boise. Families, food trucks, a bluegrass band in the background. I almost kept scrolling. There was a man at the edge of the frame, heavy jacket, baseball cap pulled low, hands in his pockets. He was walking slowly along the far side of a vendor row, and something about the way he moved made my thumb stop, the hitch in his left knee. The way he held his shoulders slightly forward like he was always about to lean into something. I'd watched Danny walk his whole life. I knew that walk the way you know a song you grew up hearing. I watched the clip 4 times, then I screenshotted a frame and zoomed in as far as my phone would allow. The scar on his right wrist, a pale crescent-shaped mark Danny got at 17 when a belt sander slipped in shop class. I'd driven him to the ER myself, 12 stitches. I used to tease him about it every summer when he wore short sleeves. I sat at that table for a long time. The chili went completely cold. My hands were steady, which surprised me. What I felt wasn't panic. It was more like something clicking into place after 3 years of being slightly, persistently wrong. I knew what I was looking at, and I knew that if I called the sheriff's office, they'd tell me I was a grieving father seeing what I wanted to see. They'd done it twice before, both times politely, both times final. So I called Pete Callahan. Pete had been Danny's closest friend since they were both 19, learning the trade together at the vocational program in Laurel. He was a straight-talking guy, a mechanic by trade, not given to drama or wild ideas. When Danny disappeared, Pete had quietly told me he didn't buy the accident story. He said Danny had called him about a week before, worried about something at the shop, wouldn't give specifics. Just said he needed to have a hard conversation with Sandra soon, and that he was nervous about it. Pete drove to my place that same night. We sat at the table, watched the clip a dozen more times, and by midnight we'd made a decision. We were going to Boise. We took Pete's truck. The drive was 7 hours, and we didn't talk much. Somewhere past Pocatello, Pete asked what the plan was if it really was Danny. I told him I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. Ridgeview Recovery Center sat on a hill on the outskirts of the city. Clean building, professional landscaping, the kind of place that looked expensive without looking flashy. Their website said they specialized in long-term neurological rehabilitation. We walked in as 2 men asking about care options for Pete's aging father. A cover simple enough that neither of us would mess it up under pressure. The woman at the front desk was polite and helpful. She walked Pete through a brochure. I stood slightly behind him and kept my eyes moving around the room. Through a glass partition into the common room beyond the desk, I saw him. He was sitting in a chair near the window, not a wheelchair, just a regular chair, but he was sitting in it like he didn't quite know how to hold his own weight. Thinner than I remembered, beard he'd never had before, but the shape of his face, the line of his jaw, the way he held his hands folded in his lap, that was my son. That was Danny. I had to put my hand on the edge of the reception desk to keep myself from walking straight through that partition. On the patient board behind the desk, I caught a name written in marker. Eric Nash, admitted February 2021. TBI, no prior records on file, no prior records. Because there weren't any. Because Danny Pruitt didn't exist in this building. Pete must have seen something change in my face because he wrapped up the conversation smoothly, thanked the woman, and steered me back out through the front door before I could do anything we'd both regret. We walked to the parking lot. I stood next to the truck and didn't say anything for a moment. Pete said, "It's him, isn't it?" I said yes. He nodded once. "Okay. So what do we do about it?" We drove to a motel on the south side of the city and got 2 rooms. I sat on the edge of my bed for a while, not sleeping, just running through everything I knew and everything I didn't. After 3 years of dead ends, I'd learned one thing. Moving fast without thinking got you nowhere. What I needed was a plan that didn't fall apart the moment someone pushed back. The problem wasn't finding Danny. I'd already done that. The problem was proving who he was, proving how he got there, and making sure the people responsible couldn't undo any of it before the right authorities had everything in hand. I thought about Sandra, about the way she'd cried at that memorial service, about how she'd called me every Sunday for the first year after Danny disappeared, checking in, asking how I was holding up. I'd believed every word of it. That's the thing about being betrayed by someone you've known your whole life. You don't see it coming because you've spent decades building a picture of who they are, and your brain refuses to update the image even when the evidence is right in front of you. Sandra and I had grown up in a 2-bedroom house in Laurel. Our dad worked the railroad. Our mom cleaned houses. There wasn't much money, but there was a lot of loyalty, and that loyalty was the thing I was most proud of carrying into adulthood. When Evelyn got her diagnosis, Sandra drove 4 hours to sit with us in the oncology waiting room. She didn't ask if we needed her. She just showed up. I thought that said everything about who she was. I was wrong about that. The next morning, I called Pete into my room and we mapped out what we needed. First, financial records from the shop. Second, something wrong with the insurance claim. Third, a direct connection between Sandra and whoever had put Danny in that facility under a false name. Pete had kept in loose contact with a couple of Danny's former employees. Guys Sandra had quietly let go in the months after taking over the shop. He reached out to one of them that afternoon, a mechanic named Carl who'd worked for Danny since the beginning. Carl was cautious at first. He'd signed some paperwork when Sandra dismissed him, the kind with language about confidentiality that probably wasn't legally enforceable but scared him anyway. Pete talked him through it, told him what we suspected without telling him everything we knew. By the end of the call, Carl agreed to meet us. We drove to a diner on the east side of Boise the following morning. Carl was already there when we arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee and a manila envelope on the table in front of him. He was in his mid-40s, quiet, the kind of man who chose his words carefully and meant what he said. He slid the envelope across to me. Inside were photocopies of monthly account statements he'd kept from his time at the shop. Old habit, he said. He'd always made personal copies of the financials because Danny trusted him with the books, and he wanted a clean record in case anything was ever questioned. He'd never imagined they'd matter like this. I went through the pages slowly. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Starting about 8 months before Danny disappeared, there were regular payments going out to vendor names Carl didn't recognize. Small at first, a few thousand here and there, the kind of amounts that wouldn't raise an immediate flag, then larger. By the month before Danny vanished, roughly $140,000 had moved out of the operating account to entities Carl had never seen do any actual work for the shop. Danny had found it. Carl said Danny had pulled him aside about 2 weeks before the accident, shown him some of the same discrepancies, and told him he was going to confront Sandra and Dale about it directly. Carl had advised him to bring in an outside accountant first, get everything documented before saying a word. Danny said he would. Then he disappeared. Carl looked at the table when he said that last part. He'd carried it for 3 years. I thanked him and told him to keep himself out of it for now, that his copies were enough. He nodded, finished his coffee, and left. That afternoon, I called an attorney in Billings I'd used years before for a property dispute, a straightforward man named Gerald Huff who didn't waste words. I told him I needed someone to pull the insurance claim documents on Danny's life insurance policy and look for anything irregular. I didn't explain why. I said I had reason to believe the claim had been filed incorrectly and I needed it confirmed on paper before I took it anywhere official. Gerald called me back in 4 days. He'd found it. Sandra had listed the date of Danny's death as February 14th, 2021, the night of the accident. But the legal declaration of death didn't come from the court until August 2022, 18 months later. Insurance companies work off the legal declaration date, not the presumed date of death, unless there's a certified exception on file. There was no exception. Sandra had filed using the earlier date, and somehow it had moved through without being caught. Gerald said it wasn't necessarily fraud on its own, could have been a paperwork error, but combined with other evidence, it was exactly the kind of thing a federal prosecutor would want in their file. I wrote everything down in a notebook: the vendor payments, the timeline, the insurance date discrepancy. The facility in Boise, with a patient named Eric Nash, who had no medical history before February 2021. What I didn't have yet was a direct connection, something that put Sandra's hands on the decision to put Danny in that room. Carl's record showed money leaving the shop. Gerald's findings showed a filing error. But none of it proved Sandra knew Danny was alive. None of it proved she'd arranged for him to be hidden. For that, I needed Sandra herself to tell me. I drove back to Billings alone, left Pete in Boise to keep an eye on the facility, and I called my sister. I told her I'd been doing a lot of thinking, that I was tired of carrying everything, that I wanted to talk about selling the small piece of land Danny had owned outside town, split whatever it brought, and finally close the chapter. I said I was ready to move forward. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought that was healthy, that she was glad I was getting to a better place. Her voice was warm and steady, the voice of a woman who'd had 3 years to practice being the grieving one. We agreed to meet for coffee the following Saturday. She said she'd bring Dale. I said that was fine. I hung up and sat in my truck in the parking lot of a gas station outside Laurel for a long time, watching the traffic pass on the interstate. I thought about our mother, who had trusted everyone she ever met and never once regretted it. I thought about what I was about to do to the last living member of my immediate family. Then I thought about Danny sitting in that chair by the window, 500 miles from home, not knowing his own name. I started the truck and drove home. The coffee shop Sandra picked was a place we'd been going to together for years. A corner spot downtown with booths along the window and a counter that still had spinning stools. We'd sat in that same back booth after our mother's funeral. We'd sat there the week after Evelyn died. It was the kind of place that meant something, and I think she chose it deliberately, the same way she'd chosen everything else in those 3 years, carefully, with an eye on how it would look. She was already there when I arrived, Dale beside her. Dale Norris was 53, medium build, the kind of man who dressed one level above what the occasion required. He'd been the shop's accountant for 6 years before Danny disappeared, and he'd stayed on after Sandra took over. He always shook hands too firmly and smiled about a half-second too long. Danny had never warmed to him. At the time, I'd thought Danny was being unfair. I sat down across from them and ordered coffee and kept my voice easy. I talked about the land parcel, the acreage Danny had bought east of town with the idea of eventually building a bigger shop facility. I said I'd had it appraised, that it was worth splitting, that holding on to it wasn't doing either of us any good. Sandra agreed. She talked about closing chapters. She talked about honoring Danny's memory by not letting his assets sit idle. My phone was in my jacket pocket, recording app running. Montana is a one-party consent state. I checked that 3 times before leaving the house. For the first 20 minutes, it was careful and ordinary. Sandra was good. She'd always been good with people, good at reading a room and giving it what it wanted. She gave me the version of herself I'd believed in for 60 years. Warm, reasonable, sad in a way that seemed genuine. If I hadn't seen Danny through that partition in Boise, I might have walked out of there still believing it. Then I shifted the conversation. I mentioned I'd been going through some of Danny's old paperwork, boxes I hadn't been able to face for a long time. I said I'd found some financial documents that confused me, account statements with vendor names I didn't recognize. I kept my tone mild, like a man genuinely puzzled, not a man who'd spent 2 weeks building a case. Something changed in Sandra's face. It was small and fast, and she covered it immediately, but I'd been watching for it. She said those were probably just standard operating expenses, that small shops often used contractors and vendors that weren't well documented. She said Danny hadn't always been the most organized with paperwork. Dale nodded along beside her, contributing nothing useful. I said I suppose that made sense, but that 1 or 2 of the payments seemed large for a shop that size, and that I'd been thinking about having someone look into it just for my own peace of mind. Sandra set her coffee cup down. She looked at me directly and said, "Harold, Danny wasn't always making the best decisions toward the end. You know that. He was under a lot of stress. The shop was struggling more than he let on to either of us." I asked what kind of stress she meant. She said he'd been making some questionable financial choices for a while before the accident, that she'd tried to talk to him about it, that it had put a strain on their working relationship. Dale was nodding again, confirming the way a man does when he's been coached. Then she said it, the sentence I'd been waiting for without knowing exactly what form it would take. She said, honestly, even if things had gone differently, I'm not sure Danny would have been able to hold that business together long term. He didn't have the temperament for it. She said it the way you talk about a man who is dead and cannot hear you, easy. Final, like a door closed on a room nobody uses anymore. I kept my face neutral. I took a sip of coffee. I said that was probably right and steered the conversation back toward the land parcel. and we spent another 10 minutes working out a notional figure before I said I needed to get going and would have Gerald draw something up. I shook Dale's hand. I hugged Sandra at the door. She held on a half-second longer than usual, and I let her standing there on the sidewalk outside the place where we'd buried our grief together twice over, and I thought about how well I'd known her and how wrong I'd been. I walked to my truck, drove 4 blocks, pulled into a parking garage, and sat there for a while with the engine off. Then I took out my phone, confirmed the recording had captured everything cleanly, and called Gerald Huff. I told him I needed a referral to someone at the FBI field office in Billings. I told him I had a case involving insurance fraud, financial fraud, and unlawful imprisonment crossing state lines, and that I had documentation and a recorded conversation to support it. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd make a call that afternoon. Agent Gloria Tate contacted me 2 days later. She was in her late 40s, measured in the way she spoke, and she did not treat me like a confused old man with a theory. She listened to everything I had, asked precise questions, and when I finished, she told me they were already familiar with Dale Norris from a separate financial investigation that had stalled 2 years earlier for lack of direct evidence. She said what I'd brought might be exactly what they needed to move. I gave her everything. Carl's account records, Gerald's insurance filing analysis, the recording from the coffee shop, the name Eric Nash at Ridgeview Recovery Center in Boise, admitted February 2021, no prior medical history on file. She told me to stay available and not to contact Sandra again. I said I understood. The following 8 days were the longest of my life. I went back to work on a rewiring job I'd taken on for a neighbor, mostly to keep my hands busy. Pete called every evening from Boise with updates. Danny was still there, still listed as Eric Nash, still sitting by that window most afternoons. Pete had made a second visit to the facility under a different cover story, inquiring about a long-term placement for a family member. He'd gotten a clearer look at the common room. He said Danny had looked up when Pete came through the lobby, just briefly, the way a man looks at movement out of habit rather than interest. Pete said his eyes were glassy but not entirely absent, like someone trying to see through frosted glass. I held on to that. I held on to it every night that week when I couldn't sleep. On the 9th day, Gloria Tate called and said they were ready to move. They executed warrants simultaneously at Ridgeview Recovery Center and at Sandra's home on a Thursday morning. Gloria Tate had coordinated with the Boise field office, so both locations were hit within minutes of each other. She'd told me I could be present at Ridgeview as a family member, but that I needed to stay outside the building until they'd secured the scene. I drove down the night before and slept 3 hours in the same motel Pete and I had used the first time. Pete was waiting in the parking lot when I pulled in that morning. We didn't say much. We drank gas station coffee and watched the sun come up over the hills east of the facility. The FBI vehicles arrived at 7:40 a.m. 4 of them, moving without urgency, the kind of calm that comes from having done this many times. Gloria Tate went in with her team. A separate unit was already at Sandra's address in Billings. Dale Norris was picked up at his apartment 20 minutes later. Gloria had told me the night before that Dale's attorney had already reached out to the prosecutor's office. He was going to cooperate. We waited outside for just over an hour. I watched the entrance and didn't let myself think past the next few minutes. Pete stood beside me and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Then the front doors opened and Gloria came out, and behind her, walking slowly with a hand on the arm of a younger agent, was Danny. He was thinner than I'd ever seen him. The beard was longer up close. He was wearing clothes that didn't fit right, the kind of generic items a facility keeps on hand, and he was moving carefully, like a man who wasn't entirely sure the ground was level. His eyes were scanning the parking lot without focus, the way eyes do when they're not getting clear signals from the brain behind them. I walked toward him. Gloria gave me a small nod. I stopped a few feet away and said his name, not loudly, just the way you say someone's name when you want them to know it's safe. He stopped walking, his eyes moved to my face, and I could see him working at it, trying to bring something into focus through whatever fog they'd kept him in for 3 years. I said, "Danny, it's Dad. I'm right here." He stood very still. Then something shifted in his face, not recognition exactly, not yet, but something underneath recognition, something that didn't need a clear mind to work. He said, "That's Dad's voice." I closed the distance and put my hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into it like a man who'd been holding himself upright for a very long time without anything to lean on. We stood there in that parking lot in the early morning light, and I didn't say anything else for a while. There wasn't anything to say. The medical team that came with the FBI confirmed what we already suspected. Danny had been maintained on a low-dose sedative and antipsychotic regimen for the duration of his stay, enough to keep him foggy and compliant, unable to hold a coherent thought long enough to ask the right questions or find a way out. The staff at Ridgeview had been told he was a severe TBI patient with no living family. Most of them had no idea. The facility's attending physician, a man named Arnold Feld, was taken into custody separately. He'd been paid to manage the medication protocol and document nothing unusual. They transferred Danny to a hospital in Boise for evaluation. The neurologist who examined him said there was no permanent structural damage. The brain can recover from chemical suppression if the cause is removed in time. She said given proper care and time off the medications, he should regain most of his cognitive function. She was right. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. He had gaps, stretches of the 3 years that were simply gone, dissolved by whatever they'd been giving him. He remembered the shop. He remembered Lily. He remembered Evelyn, though. She'd been gone before any of this started. The things that mattered most had survived. His sense of humor came back first. 2 days after admission, he looked at the hospital breakfast tray and said the eggs looked like something he'd seen under his truck once. The nurse laughed. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in 3 years without it feeling wrong. I brought Lily to see him on the 9th day. She'd been staying with me on and off since Sandra's arrest, which had made the local news in Billings and required more explaining than a 7-year-old should have to absorb. I kept it simple for her. I told her that her dad had been very sick and that some people had kept him from coming home, but that we'd found him and he was getting better and she was going to see him soon. She processed this the way children process things that are too large to hold, by going quiet for a day and then asking very specific practical questions. She wanted to know if he still had the same truck. She wanted to know if he still remembered her favorite color. She wanted to know if she could bring him something. She brought him a drawing she'd made of the two of them standing outside the shop. She'd drawn him taller than the building. When we walked into his hospital room, Danny looked up from the bed and saw her in the doorway, and his face did something I don't have the right word for. She looked at him for about 2 seconds, long enough to confirm what she already knew, and then she crossed the room and climbed up onto the bed beside him and put her head against his arm. He held on with both hands and didn't let go for a long time. I stepped back into the hallway and gave them the room. Sandra and Dale were both denied bail. The charges included insurance fraud, financial fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Dale's cooperation with the prosecution filled in the gaps that the documents alone couldn't cover. He confirmed that Sandra had arranged Danny's placement at Ridgeview through a contact of Dale's who knew Arnold Feld, and that the plan had been in place before Danny disappeared. The prosecutor told me they were looking at 10 to 15 years given the severity and duration of the offenses. The morning Sandra was formally arraigned, I drove to the courthouse and stood outside on the steps. I wasn't sure why I'd come. I didn't go inside. I just stood there in the cold until they brought her out to the transport vehicle, and she saw me across the lot. We looked at each other for a moment. I said, "Mom would have been ashamed of you." She looked away, they put her in the vehicle and drove off, and I stood there until the vehicle was out of sight. Danny moved back to Billings 2 months after his release. He and Lily stayed with me through the winter. Some mornings he'd be quiet in a way that told me he was working through something I couldn't reach, and I'd learned by then to let those mornings be what they were. Other mornings he'd be at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, 2 coffees already poured, talking to Lily about nothing in particular while she ate cereal and argued with him about cartoons. Those mornings were enough. More than enough. By spring he was talking about reopening the shop. Pete had kept a few of the old customers in the loop through the winter, letting them know things might be changing for the better. The day Danny walked back into that garage for the first time, he ran his hand along the workbench he'd built himself a decade earlier and stood there without saying anything. Then he said it smelled the same. I told him some things don't change. He looked at me and nodded like that meant something beyond the words. I'm not going to tell you everything went back to normal, because it didn't. Normal was gone a long time ago. What we built instead was something that knew what it had cost, and maybe that made it sturdier. I don't know. I'm an electrician, not a philosopher. What I know is this. 3 years ago, the system looked at the evidence it had and closed the file, and I understood why. I'm not angry at the people who told me to move on. They were working with what they could see, but I knew my son's walk. I knew that scar on his wrist, and I decided that what I knew was worth more than what I'd been told. If you're reading this and you've got something that doesn't add up, something the official version doesn't explain, something small that keeps nagging at you in the quiet hours, don't let anyone talk you out of it. You don't have to be reckless. You don't have to break anything. You just have to be patient, be methodical, and trust what you know. The truth doesn't always come easy, but it comes.